A few years back, they decided to close one of the local hospitals called St. Joseph's, a little ways outside of the town where I lived. It wasn't surprising that they decided to wind it down. The area was a slightly isolated township and had been slowly dying off since the financial crisis. Lots of people had moved out, and there were many derelict houses and buildings. In order to minimise the impact on the community, the closure was phased. It transitioned into a teaching hospital with a few surgeries and day patients, and they kept the geriatric ward open for now. I'm a 28-year-old female nurse, just a few years out of college. I don't have an established nursing job and have to rely on agency work and short-term contracts. When the closure of St. Joseph's was announced, a lot of the established and senior nurses jumped ship to other jobs, which opened up some work for people like me. An agency was able to get me into St. Joseph's on a 3-month contract. It was night duty, which wasn't anyone's preference, of course, but it was good to get some nicely paid work. Only 3 months initially, but it could last up to 2 years. In addition, getting in suite with an agency would inevitably lead to more opportunities as well. Initially, I was a ward sister on the geriatric ward. God bless our senior citizens, but the geriatric ward could be a bit of a nightmare. Many seniors who had declined mentally had no sleep pattern at all, and would sit up at night wailing or talking to themselves. This in turn would disturb the seniors who were trying to sleep, and at times it could be a real circus in there all night long. There was one elderly lady in particular whose bed was situated right beside the nurse's station. She never slept a wink, and the whole time she was awake she would tell me about the evil that lurked within these walls and all that sort of stuff. She even claimed that she saw the evil outside the windows and that, quote, they were moving around outside all night long. It really was a bit of a trial, but it was what I had to put up with to get valuable career experience. 2 months into my contract, I got some excellent news. Firstly, the contract was extended indefinitely, and secondly, I was being moved to the main night station near the entrance to the hospital. Compared to the geriatric ward, it was heaven. 2 of us were there each night, mainly doing admin work, but we would take it in turn to do rounds of the hospital, carrying out checklists, making sure supplies and equipment were in order, that sort of thing. I started to actually enjoy the job, apart from the nights, and maybe sometime soon that would change. One night it was my turn to do the rounds, and everything was perfectly normal at first. I was checking some equipment in a consultation room when I heard a small crash and a distant grunt coming from somewhere out in the darkened hallway. I paused and listened out, hearing nothing for the next several seconds. I thought of ignoring what had just happened, but conscience got the better of me. One of the geriatric patients could have crept off the ward, and God knows what trouble they could get themselves in. Out in the hallway there was silence again. Then I heard it, a soft panting, followed by an almost animalistic growl, coming from a room straight across the hall. I was convinced a senior had got themselves in there and possibly locked themselves in. I sighed and walked to the door of the room, looking up briefly at the sign on the door as I went in. The sign said, Blood Bank. As soon as I opened the door, I saw a hunched figure in the dim light of an open fridge. The figure turned towards me, and I saw a horrifying face with what looked like glowing red eyes. The figure growled as they turned round. Instinctively, I screamed out in terror and ran into the corridor. As luck would have it, one of the security guards on his rounds had just entered the far end of the hallway. He shouted out what's wrong, and I screamed for help. From inside the blood bank, I heard a huge crash. The security guard charged down the hall and fearlessly into the blood bank. Just a second later, he strode out again, panting. Whoever it was, he said, just jumped out the window. He must have been as high as a kite. The police were called and came quickly, and they spoke to me and the security guard. I was very shaken and not making too much sense. The security guard and the police were so good with me. I told them how terrible the man looked, and they reassured me that he was probably a drug addict trying to steal something, and that's why I was so scared by his appearance. The agency called the next day and said to take as long as I needed before coming back to work on full pay. More great news came later in the week when the agency called to offer me a new job, permanent, full-time, in one of the big hospitals in town. I was so relieved that I didn't have to go back there, because quite honestly, I was having a few nightmares about the horrific figure that confronted me. For every time I consoled myself that it was just a disfigured addict, the memory terrified me, and I asked myself, what was that awful figure doing in the blood bank? I'm not a big fan of dating sites, who is, of course, but sometimes I get sucked back into them, be it through boredom, loneliness, or whatever. It was springtime earlier this year, and I decided, what the hell, I'd see what was out there. Probably not much, of course, but after a long winter, I was ready to give it a shot. I've heard that when you join these sites, you get a lot of exposure as a new profile. The opening couple of weeks are where you might luck out to something good. After that, it may be a bit more of a slog. The first few days weren't up to much, but then, out of nowhere, I suddenly received a message from this beautiful girl. Now, I'm certainly not chopped liver, and I wouldn't say she was completely out of my league, but I was pleasantly surprised, let's put it that way. She had particularly captivating eyes, was slightly dusky and exotic looking, and everything else about her was very attractive. Unlike a lot of brief and dissatisfying dating site interactions, Monica, that was her name, was very chatty and very charming. She seemed extremely interested. Listen, I'm logical and not the most romantic guy in the world, so I didn't get too carried away. It was pretty exciting though. We graduated to talking on the phone, which went very well. I didn't see any point in messing around, and asked her to meet me on Saturday night. Without hesitation, she agreed. In the lead up to Saturday, I was half expecting a text message saying there was a sick grandmother or whatever, and the date was off. But there was only a message confirming the time and place, and I mentioned that she was looking forward to meeting up. The first time meeting someone, I think it's best to be informal, so we met at a downtown bar for a couple of drinks. Monica was at least as attractive as she had been on the dating site. Her eyes, even more captivating. We sat at the bar and got on great. The barman, and even some of the female bar staff, seemed to be as fascinated with Monica as I was. That wasn't surprising. There was something strangely magnetic and fascinating about her. We talked about many subjects, including a current big news story in the city where we lived. A few men had disappeared without a trace, and the police weren't sure if foul play was involved, or whether they'd just decided they'd had enough of life here. We were joking around that maybe the so-called smiley face killer was on the prowl in our city. It was great fun, and when the time came to leave, I said I'd walk her to the transit station. She accepted and commented that that was very nice of me to do that. As we were walking down the street, she suddenly stopped and said, "You've been so nice." I said, "Thanks." We were on a quiet part of the street with some industrial and office buildings. There was no one else around at that moment. Monica suddenly turned and looked up a dark alleyway to her left. "Let's go up there," she said. "What for?" I asked. She just smiled. I'm not that trashy, so I went to say no, but as I tried to open my mouth, I felt suddenly almost paralysed. I was looking straight into her eyes, and they seemed to shine even more than usual. I felt a strange drowsiness, almost like I was slowly being anaesthetised. Equally slowly, as if looking on from outside my own body, I felt my feet start to move, walking towards the alleyway. Monica was leading me by the hand towards the darkness beyond, smiling all the way. I felt like resisting, but I couldn't take my eyes away from hers. I was falling towards blackness, the blackness of the alleyway, and what seemed like a dark pool of blackness gathering around my eyes. Then, I was aware of nothing. That might have been all I remembered. Suddenly, I heard a loud crash, which snapped me straight out of the trance I was in. Monica and I were standing at the entrance to the alleyway. Her face snapped angrily to look over my shoulder at the commotion behind, and my gaze followed. A couple of drunk guys were stumbling down the street in the direction of the transit station, and one of them had taken a dive over a garbage can. They were laughing and shouting and making a lot of noise, more than enough to break the spell I was under. Shielding my eyes from Monica's gaze, I turned around, but to my amazement, she was striding out and down the street, already 50 yards away, and quickening her pace all the while. I wasn't woozy in the slightest. I'd come straight back into the moment. Calling an Uber and getting picked up back at the bar, I went home, silently contemplating the incredibly disturbing thing that had just happened to me. My first thought was that I'd been set up for a robbery with some GHB or whatever slipped into my drink. Then doubts started to grow. Why didn't it affect me earlier than it had? And how come I snapped out of it straight away? What about Monica's paralysing stare? I've watched as many horror films as the next guy, and the crazy thought came into my head about what Monica could have been. I'm ashamed to say I checked my neck. Nothing. I blocked Monica's number and spent a rough night worrying. Thank God she didn't know where I lived. The next few days were rough as well, but soon I forgot. The dating sites were deleted off my phone, needless to say, and ironically, I met a great person in real life a short time later. I'm sure I'm safe now, but now and then the thought of that night still chills my bones. As does the story of the two guys disappearing in town, just a few short weeks before I met Monica. They never did solve that one. I'm not ashamed to say it, but a few years ago I spent a summer sleeping in my car. I'd had a breakup and had to hightail it out of where I lived, with not a moment to lose. Even though I had a job, I was living paycheck to paycheck and wasn't financially prepared for the cost of first and last month's rent for a new place in this hyper-expensive city I call home. Of course, you can't just sleep anywhere in your car. The cops were cruising around at night and there was no way you wouldn't be seen and moved on sooner or later. The days of rolling up on a Walmart or shopping mall car park for the night were gone too, unless you could find some sort of blind spot. I found this old gravel parking lot near some sports fields next to a beach, looking back across the lake at the city skyline. It was an old industrial area and they hadn't redeveloped it into condos or whatever because there was a lot of pollution in the area and an expensive cleanup would be required before anything residential could be built there. My temporary resting place had a bit of a problem in that the car park and nearby beach area had a reputation as a lover's lane. It was very quiet during the week, but was all action at the weekends until about 3 a.m. That was a pain, but also my saviour, because the cops accepted that that was what was going on down there, so they didn't roll up on anybody. I kept myself to myself and concentrated on getting a night's sleep, so was left alone by the Lover's Lane patrons as well. I got through most of the summer that way. One Saturday night into Sunday morning in August, about 4 a.m, I was happily in the land of dreams. The Lover's Lane crowd were long gone, and my beat-up old van was the lone vehicle in the car park. I was awoken from my reverie by a loud thud on the window close by my head. I nearly crapped myself from the noise and let out a drowsy grunt as I was shocked into something approaching wakefulness. My first thought was that a stone or a rock had hit the glass, and I was surprised that the window hadn't gone through. Looking up over the rim of the door, I saw something which both baffled and shocked me. Some small creature was flying slowly away in the darkness. Was this really just what hit the car? A bird strike? Maybe I was seeing things, and in what seemed like a second, the flapping creature had disappeared. After another moment, and seemingly out of nowhere, mist started to gather in the near distance, seeming to move slowly towards my car. Okay, this was getting weird. I know I was near the lake, but there hadn't been the slightest breath of mist anywhere that night. While I was contemplating the strangeness of that, what I saw next sent chills up my spine. Slowly revealed out of the mist, a dark, seemingly cloaked figure was moving slowly towards me. It obviously wasn't a cop, which meant it must have been a creep, or something worse. I wasn't sticking around to find out. Luckily, I had my van set up for a quick getaway. Not exactly in anticipation of this kind of situation, but for any hairy situation that might come my way. The passenger seat was down, the driver's seat left in position, so I could just slide forward and into the driver's seat to hit the road quickly. The van was a push-button start, and thank God it started without grumbling. In my wing mirror, I caught sight of the dark, cloaked figure. Moving quicker now, I just had a half second to catch sight of jet black hair and a remarkably pale face. I reversed full speed. The figure jumped out of the way as I careered past. Now all that was left to do was put it into drive, turn slightly to the right, and gun it out of there. I looked down to get the car in drive. Then when I looked up, there was the dark figure standing in my way, further across the car park, blocking my exit. Like I said, I wasn't messing around, and I didn't care if I hit whatever was in front of me. I burned rubber and shot forward, roaring with anger, ploughing straight for the dark and misty figure in my headlights. Then, just as I would have run him over, the figure disappeared. Just like that. By the time I reached the far side of the car park, I stopped momentarily and looked into the rearview mirror. Nothing, except for a faint wisp of mist. I booked it out of there and checked into a crummy hotel for the rest of the night and the following day. It didn't take me long to decide that my days of living out of my car were well and truly over. Things were tight, but I had just about enough money at that moment for first and last. As it turned out, I eventually found a condo on a high floor looking out over the lake. From my window, I could see the beach on the other side, and almost see the car park area where I had had the bejesus scared out of me that hot August night by someone or something.